So let me share my screen. So yeah, so this is a bit of the continuation on, I was not able to provide all the slides because I have been focused on implementation a little bit. So the idea is to go back a bit about function runtime. Now function runtime, by the way, the name will change. So don't hang up on that. But we had a review last week. So I'm not sure whether I have to do a small recap or I go straight into the meat. Is there anyone who wants to do a recap, a bit or short recap?
A short recap would be appreciated.
Actually, before we do it, is there anybody who has any? We started the new sprint. I think we've been doing those meetings in the sub-project meetings. We've been talking about what we're getting done. We did say that the theme of this sprint, I think SIG Release, what we want to have, like, you know, a basic end-to-end solution that can start integration tests up and running by the end of this sprint. Is there anything else people need to talk about that before we dive into this deeper subject?
So I had one question. It's actually a dependency, and we briefly spoke. I don't want to spend too much time because we cannot even talk during Wim's meeting. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand. It's about what are we going to do with the IPMI code base? How are we going to manage it? Obviously, that's a critical portion. So I think that's something probably we can discuss deep in Wim's meeting tomorrow or day after as well.
And tomorrow, yeah, we can look at it tomorrow.
Yeah, because whether we are gonna put it in the Nephio repo or are we gonna just consume it as an artifact, for one way or the other, we need to figure out if we want to start integration testing next month.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know whose hand is first, but Simon or Tal.
I think it's
Simon. Okay, Simon. Yeah.
Sorry. Is it right to left or left to right?
I don't know. I don't even know that it's ordered.
Top to bottom. I see it on the top here.
Yes, so I have a question. I was not here last week, but in the meeting minutes, it says next week for sprint planning, each sub-project should be ready to highlight their major deliverables. I was under the impression that this today was the sprint planning that was mentioned, or is that separate? I'm a bit confused now.
No, you're right. So each sub-project is doing their own sprint planning, and we did say we would give each sub-project would give a quick summary here this week on what they plan to deliver. And so I guess we should do that since we said we would do that. But sprint planning itself, there's the three sub-projects met Monday and yesterday to do that, the detailed sprint planning, rather than doing it all as a large group.
Okay. Okay, then sorry, my mistake. Then I will catch up, I think, for the package management sub-project, and yeah, we'll figure something out that I will pick up. I thought it was today, like there was a bigger sprint planning. But okay, I will reach out either to you or tomorrow in the sub-project.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I mean, I think right now for package management, so you know, we're working on the installer, we're working on the controller manager, you know, kind of framework piece, and then on the upstream package variant pieces. Those are, and then, you know, and then example packages to exercise those things. So those are kind of the things we're planning for this sprint to get, you know, make progress on. I think we should have a basic running piece of each of those things. The one that's a little more questionable is the upstream piece because of CLA issues. The Nokia folks can't contribute in there right now, and I'm on vacation next week. So I will have some pieces of that done, but the whole thing won't be done this sprint. So that's on the package management side, but you and I can sync up later, and if there's areas you may want to be interested in picking up.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yes, on the board is up. Just wanted to add to what John said. The board is up. for individual teams as well, in terms of what's planned, what's to do, what's in progress, things like that. Please take a look at that as well. Yeah.
And so then Tal's had his hand up, but just in addition to whatever you wanted to talk about, Tal, probably give an update on what you're planning in your sub-project.
Sure. Well, we have the first example of a controller in the Free5GC repository. By the way, we still haven't changed repository names. I don't know if we agreed on the naming scheme, but I hope that happens soon too. Yeah, we dissected it quite a bit, and we're kind of treating it as the first example that the other controllers should copy. So we have a few issues. I didn't open them quite yet, but they're documented. And today, actually, after this meeting, I'm going to go ahead and open them as actual issues. I have a list of issues to open for this sprint. Yep, so that's it. Moving ahead. And maybe just so other people know if they're not in that sub-project. So, you know, I raised the point that we need to own our container images for the operators too. Until now, we were just kind of using upstream versions, but we should either include them in the same repository others, if it's Docker files or something else, a way to build the container images.
Yeah, we should be built. I mean, we can use a base image from some upstream, like, you know, DistroList or whatever, but yeah, we should be definitely building our own images and pushing them to the Docker repo. I think SIG Release was working on that.
Right. So it's a SIG Release thing, but I'm mentioning it here. And really the reason I raised my hand was another maybe SIG Release related thing, which is, let me share it. So, you know, you asked right now, John, you know, before we move into creating tests and everything and integrating, I think we need to decide on how we actually run test and what is our interface, right? I know there have been a few uses of makefiles, and they existed in the Google Seed code, and we're kind of just going ahead with it. But I thought it should be open for discussion. It doesn't have to happen here. I think it might be more a SIG Release issue, but it could be a SIG automation issue. But I think as a community, we should decide on something and go ahead, because otherwise we'll have just lots of different ways of wrapping these repositories. So yeah, I think maybe a good thing is for people just to comment on that issue with their own opinions here and there. And at some point, maybe we can finish the discussion and decide.
Yeah, there is some people who already started to use the make files, right?
Right, which is why I'm kind of like, slow down. Let's decide together before we actually set facts on the ground that will be difficult later to change. Let's do things deliberately, not just because they're there. That's my point. If we decide to make files, that's great. Yeah, together as a community.
It's probably something we have to discuss in SIG Release, I believe, not?
I agree. Yeah, but I'm raising it here because we are users of that. So if people aren't involved, please look at this issue. That's it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Then Wim, did you want to talk about the plan in?
Yeah. So I think so we started to so we have a bunch of codes happening. So for me the good thing is, but we did not accomplish that in sprint 1. But what is going on right now is that the library approach. I think we finally have an agreement on how to do that, so we can now replicate that. The second, so we basically start to implement. So we have prototypes of the functions, but they are not checked in, because the thing that I'm going to present is actually the gating point for it. Because I wanted to, rather than doing something check in and have a function, I want to do it in a way that we can. That's the way going forward for us for release 1. So I don't want to basically check something in and then having to redo it 10 times. So our goal is basically to do it immediately right. But of course, that creates a little bit of thinking on how to do it right. And so we are spending quite a bit of time on that. So what I'm presenting here is one important element of that. From the moment we have that, I think we have the layout of the whole thing. And the goal is I have a first implementation, by the way, of the new proposal of this thing that I'm presenting here. If we can get that going, then function implementation becomes a cookie cutter. And then the one big item that is still open for us will be the, whatever we call it, seed code. So the IPAM and VLAN, it's actually available, but I have to, so there is a bunch of testing, but it's rather a big piece of code. And I mean, there is a way to segment it, but for example, the API goes together more with the backend than with the API server. So there is, splitting it is not so easy. I mean, I can split the specializer from it, but what would be bad is to split the API with it. The API rather stays with the backend because it's a way to configure the backend.
But if it's a proto, right? So you should typically.
The proto also has a CRD. So there is a CRD. So the IP allocation you can either apply to the cluster or you can use it in the specializer. So you have both options. But they both use the gRPC at the back.
The specializer though code uses gRPC to talk to the primary server. So the proto typically would stay with the server, and then the client would generate its own client based off that proto locally.
Yes, but the CR so the CR actually, because I have also a way to configure the IPAM through CRDs.
Right. That would stay with the server, I would think. Yeah.
That would stay together, right? So that's why certain piece will be here, certain people will be there. So it's a bit, how we split it. My personal preference, or at least I prefer to have it together, but then it's a big piece of code. And we would put it, my personal view is to put it into Nepio, and then, but it's a rather big piece of code.
I think the whole thing could move into Nepio, that's fine in its own repository. And then the question becomes, when you build those specializers, they're just images, right? And they're just
sure. Yeah, correct. Yeah. You can build the images independently from each other, but what you see is that the code is rather, there is quite some relationship, and it uses, so there will be quite some dependencies.
I see. Okay, well, yeah, I guess that's something.
Should we treat that as a seed code, John, and then move it all once?
Pardon me, I misunderstood. I didn't understand what you said.
Like, should we treat that as a seed code to Wim's point, right? If the code base is huge. I mean,
well, so the question is like, so there's two pieces. In my mind, there's the IPAM backend. That could live anywhere. I'm happy to accept that as part of Nepio. And then there's the integration between Nepio and that IPAM backend. Now, Nepio itself, of which there's probably two pieces there too, right? There's one that they should be completely separate because it affects the resources within a package and talks gRPC to any backend, right? So that should be separable in my mind. And so the IPAM backend, we could swap that out for, a bespoke IPAM or Infoblox or whatever. And we still should be able to take the specializer in our environment. So that's the separation I want to make, that the IPAM backend is generic. We happen to have an implementation of an IPAM backend that supports the things we need, rather than having consumed an upstream IPAM backend ahead of time.
It's a reference implementation of a backend, basically.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Are those APIs standardized by any forum, or?
So I use the OpenConfig based method of defining it.
Well, but the API, the gRPC API between.
No, the gRPC API not.
It's a Nepio specific thing. So any other provider would have to build their own bridge.
Okay, got it. Now, when you said swap, I thought like it's somewhere there's an interoperability that's addressed. So, okay.
No. But the API is there is not much in the API in the allocation, because the gRPC is built in such a way that it's not specific to IPs, because the VLAN uses exactly the same gRPC. So there is no difference in the gRPC interface.
Mhm.
Okay, yeah, I guess it sounds like you're going to talk about that more in package specialization. From my point of view, from like a project point of view, I think we definitely would take the reference implementation of the IPAM backend, but we also need specializers that can integrate to any backend.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Any other questions on this topic before we go into in depth in the function runtime?
So one question, I mean, just a quick question. So is it just we know about the IPAM code, both the specialized and the backend. So does similar code exist for the VLAN as well, or is it
It's
not
the same repo, so it's in the same repo. I put it in, but I split it, so it's all the same. So it's one big resource allocator repo. It became.
Got it.
And
So we could use that for ASNs, or we could use that for
anything. Yeah.
anything. Yeah.
I mean, you have to sometimes, but now with VLAN, I build a very generic plugin. It's even using generics of Go, so you can actually, as long as it's a compatible identity, you can make it work. So like strings are integer-based Go types, they all fit in. So that's what I did to make it plug up. So generic. So if, for example, we need AS numbers, for example, when we want to do BGP at some point, you can just, so the VLAN backend is kind of a generic plugin that creates IDs from a DB or from a cache, and that's how it works. So basically changing from VLAN to AS or something. IPAM is a bit different because it's hierarchical, right? So you have this tree structure. So it's a bit of, so it has a separate routing table as a backend, but for VLANs it's basically a flat numbering scheme. So it's straightforward.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Then it's all you, Em.
Yeah. Okay. So quick, let's say feedback. So function runtime, name subject to change. So what was the objective that we started upon is that, yeah, in the POC, we did everything in a hurry. We had lots of duplication of code, yada, yada, yada. And so when the goal in release 1 is to avoid all of that and to generate ISO to build libraries and to do a bunch of things. The second thing that we did not cover very well is change. So everything to do with lifecycle. So we were okay to create. But if you change a parameter in the package, maybe some cases work, but the code was not basically built for that. So these are two things that we wanted to tackle in R1 so that we can do full life cycle. And secondly, that we have a bunch of libraries that we can use and I have less or code that is duplicated. So what we are trying to achieve during the specialization is what, or I start to call the conditional dance or the conditional choreography. So we have a set of independent actors that together try to achieve a common goal, right? And as a result, what you see is that what the function runtime, as its name right now, tries to do is do these lifecycle management operations in a way that the code that you have to implement for each of these functions are very small, and but together they form or they adhere to this principle of this conditional dance or choreography. And we use, the reason why I call it conditions is because we use conditions to actually convey information and of work that needs to happen and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at it, how it's built up, so you have a kept package, you have a kept function SDK as it's available from in the kept, so through the kept project. So if you look to function runtime or whatever we call this, what you see, it's actually a layer. So it's built on top of the function SDK. And when we then implement a function or a controller, we would leverage this in order to implement that, right? So that's the idea. And the goal is to limit the amount of code that you have to write when implementing a function. Okay. So now there is quite a bit of analogy to a controller, right? So I try to model the API of the SDK of the function runtime in a similar way, although not everything is exact the same. I try to model it in the same way from the controller runtime, because I mean some people are familiar with it, and then we can leverage that. So a for is basically the thing that the function acts upon. An on is what I call a child resource. So it's something that the function or the controller creates. And the watch is actually something that it's depending upon, and that it basically watches, if you will, but it doesn't own it necessarily. So it's depending on it, but it's something that you want to have as information. So sometimes it's to get data that is available in that object. And second is, so you can use that in order to enhance the operation that you do within a function. In the controller runtime, or in general in controllers, you have owner references that are used for garbage collection and stuff like that. So we have a similar capability there. So it's using annotations instead. Because one is the function SDK does not, so the kept function SDK does not expose that owner reference immediately. So you could probably do something, and it's also dangerous to, or we believe it's dangerous to use it for us right now, because these resources might end up in the cluster, and then these things will be wrong, right? So as such, we are using an annotation for it. On a delete, it's similar. So in delete, you have a delete timestamp, and then you have a finalizer. So these are the two options for delete. So we are using this. So we're also here using an annotation for the similar reason as the owner reference. So, but in essence, you get similar behavior in it. Okay. Now, when I presented last week, is if you look to the dance, there is actually two patterns that you have. And my first implementation that I did on this function runtime was I splitted that pattern into two different APIs. So there was an upstream and a downstream, right? So an upstream is basically, it's more, you could say, an entry into the function runtime or the choreography, and the downstream is more the end, although it's not 100% like that, but I think of it that way. So I think the feedback that I'll skip this for now, right? So the feedback that we got was that people didn't like it, right? So so I did a bit of work this week to actually try to remove that. So when I I accomplished that. Now during that exercise, I saw that actually currently, and by the way, so the current implementation allows for the current let's say principle, as well as for the new for the potential new approach, but we have to make a decision which one we pick, okay? Because it has implication of how the runtime or whatever we call that thing behaves. And so why do I want to discuss this? Because if you look to the current approach, and I try to I hope, so it's a very complicated picture, but what I just depicted a piece of what is happening during the specialization, right? So with the current approach, what we have, I'll try to depict it. So a circle represents the function. And then I have, so this rectangle-ish thingy basically represents the KRM resource. And the thing underneath represents the condition belonging to that KRM resource, okay? And I try to, through the color code, so if it's green, that means that you see that this function generates this condition. And if it's green here, this function also generates the IPVLAN CR, okay? It does not generate the NED because it doesn't have all the information, right? So, so the current, so I maybe just to show how it works right now is like, if you take the interface function, it has a yeah, Vish, you had a
Yeah,
question?
yeah. So you're saying in this case, as part of the specialization, the IP VLAN N3 is a new KRM resource that has been generated. It has not been
Correct.
modified. It has been generated. That is something an end user probably didn't know that would get generated, sort of.
Yes, correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to
So
confirm that.
what's, and that's part of the, let's say, the reason why I wanted to discuss this is because if you look to the whole cycle of it, and it's basically particularly interesting for the last guy here, with the current approach, this guy would have to look at these intermediate resources to be able to finalize or be able to do the final specialization. So this guy here, which is actually the end of the pipeline, would somehow magically know that this got created and use it. It's possible, but it's a little bit, yeah, I don't, personally, I don't like it as much because it sees that all of a sudden I need to look at things that, okay, do they exist? Do they not exist? So it's a bit, I mean, can you make it work? Yes, but is it, I have a feeling that it's not really the right approach.
Okay. So this is still at a point where it has not been published to the deployment repository, right? It is a specializer, which will actually then get pushed to the deployment repository and then will be approved to be applied to a live environment. So
yeah,
the
correct.
reason
So
I'm asking the question from an end user perspective is, hey, somebody went and looked at the organizational template. Now they applied the specializer and they find that there are some new things that are getting generated. I mean, I'm only looking at it from an end user perspective here. You know, who's deploying it onto a live cluster, and he sees a bunch of things are generated. And he might want to.
Hey, so just to be clear, they are not generated in the cluster; they are generated in the package. So they are never to the API server, right? So
But then it gets pushed to the deployment repository, right? All this KRM
no,
resources.
no. So what you see is that these resources have so you have a local config flag. So there's an annotation that kept uses.
Oh, a local config true, yeah.
Yeah, local config true. In which case, config sync will not apply to the deployment cluster. So these objects will never be applied to the workload cluster.
They will see them when they go to review the package to approve it.
Yeah. So they will see this new resource, basically.
In the package, but not in the API server.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you will share some examples of what this looks like, right? When it goes through.
Well, this is the current operation. I think Wim's going to give a better one.
This is the current operation. Yeah, this is the current operation.
What we're talking about here really is the approach from a developer point of view of how we're going to build our functions. So this is less of an end user view. The end user might not notice the difference between the two approaches Wim is going to talk about. This is more our own internal use, how we're building these functions and what kind of dependencies we build between the functions.
Okay, thanks.
Because in both scenarios, you see the same amount of resources. So that doesn't change, but what is different, so let me maybe go through the other approach. It's this one, right? So what you saw before, maybe let me first explain it, is so interface function runs, it generates from the config, it generates an IPv allocation, it sets a condition to false, and it also creates a condition for an NAD to be created, right? So that's what he does. And then it's done. So that's it. Okay, that's all he does. And then NAD comes and he looks at he looks at the both conditions and as well as the resources. And he generates an NAD if the IPv is okay, right? So he actually generates, so I try in the color code, try to represent who is the owner of the creation of the resource. So it means orange here is created by the NAD and green here is created by this guy, right? But the problem is, so that's not, so you'll see that it's similar in the new proposal. What is different is that this guy just runs once and it's done and it stops. But for example, if you look to a controller pattern, typically when you create what I call child resources, right? So what you typically do is you watch them And based on status changes, you potentially can do something in the controller, right? So for example, one thing that we are not doing is this guy has no idea whether this succeeded or not, right? So it just does it once. The second thing is that for this guy at the end to then, in this case, this will be the final function, do everything and collect all the information. He does not have to look at interface, but actually has to look. So he will also see NADs. He will not do anything with it, but he also has to look at IPs and VLANs that got allocated on as a result of this interface, right? And that's a pattern that I believe is not so good, because it means that tomorrow, if I do a new function, it generates other resources, then I have to again change this guy, right? So that means that who does what and who is dependent on what is a little bit blurred with the current proposal. In the new proposal, the difference is that
Wim, one question. So this when you have the IPM, so the VLAN controller, right? So this one has that external interface to the IPM management system. It's residing outside the controller, right?
yes, and that stays. There is no change there.
Yeah. No, I'm just, for completeness, it's good to just show some dot to that external system.
Okay. There's so many things on this slide because I just want to conceptually, but yeah, this reaches out to the outside, to this backend that we discussed.
Yes,
and this going to satisfy this thing. But so you see already a different behavior here. This guy writes the status back into his CR, whereas this guy is done. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So in this new or this alternative approach is that this interface still is going to create and generate these guys, but the difference is that this interface will create a condition for himself, right? That is not satisfied and is only satisfied if its children get satisfied, and then he will satisfy itself. And he will also, so there is two things. There is, he will know when his children are actually done, so he can aggregate the status, but he also will write into its status of the CR the result of the allocation that are happening here, right? So in other words, this resource will be changed by this guy if the IP got satisfied. For NAD, doesn't have to do that, but for the IPs, he would do that, right? So he would write back in the interface CR, he would write in the status field the IPs that were allocated and the VLANs that were allocated as a result of this dance, if you will, right?
So Wim, I guess it's fine. It's going to have to understand how to read those allocated values out of the status, and it's going to have some convention for how it stores them in its own status. But it needs to create those allocations anyway, so it needs to understand.
So it has already the information. It understands already. So in other words, we are not. So what is the advantage of this is that this guy doesn't never have to read this IP VLAN, so never has to look at this. He only looks at interfaces. So in other words, we could say ahead of time, okay, we need to look at interfaces and DNNs. I just put here a second thing, because in DNN it's a similar dance, although it's less complicated. Because in DNN we need a pool, so we go create also an IP allocation for type internet with a pool. He satisfies it, he would write it back into its own status. And in other words, this guy will only look at DNN and interfaces and never looks at the intermediate resources that were allocated.
Right.
And yeah, so the result of that, so the downside of that is that now this function, although it's the same implementation, would somehow need to run 2 times in the pipeline, right? So that's the disadvantage. Okay, so Vish, you had a question.
Yeah, you said the condition will be set on the resource on the API server.
No, the condition is in the kept file.
Okay, that is what I wanted to ask for clarification, because I know we have conditions, status, and conditions in the kept file. So that is what you mean when we actually apply conditions here.
Sorry,
Or-
this condition is in the condition in the kept file. Yeah.
Not in the CR, basically. It is in the kept file, in the package.
Yes, the status that I was referring to for the IP that got allocated, right, would be written in the status field of the CR, but also this interface is a requirement CR, which is not applied to the API server, right?
So when you say CR, is it the
it's
you
not- it's a
applied the
KRM
transformation? Basically, in
KRM.
that package, there's a KRM resource file. That is where it gets applied, right?
Yes, in the KRM. So there is an
Okay.
interface KRM resource, which is not applied. So that's why we make a distinction between a CR and a KRM resource.
Yeah.
So this KRM resource is up. So the status of that KRM resource is updated with the IP information.
Yeah, the KRM
and-
resource gets applied. Okay.
Yes.
And
So
then the
this-
KPD file gets applied, the conditions get applied on the KPD file, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Just wanted to be clear on that because I know nothing is applied yet to the cluster. And when we think about CR, we are thinking about a cluster. So sorry, I know you had mentioned this in the past, but just wanted to get confirmation and clarification.
Yeah. All right. Dimitrios.
Yes, just one quick question. Here we're talking about one NAD per interface, so we don't have a shared NAD that can actually be used by different virtual functions, right? We're talking about one network attachment definition per interface. So for a second interface that maybe it uses the same an IP from the same subnet, you need also an extra NAD for that.
Yes, so at the moment that's what we are doing, but yeah, so that's the current approach because we did the one-to-one mapping because it's easier. But that can of course change going forward. But right now we did one-to-one. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Bala.
Yeah, Wim. I know you know what I'm going to talk about. So I wanted to discuss about what we were discussing about Slack, but I know it's gonna take a few minutes. Would you? I just wanted to ask you: is it a good point to good time to talk about it, or would you rather present? If you have a few more slides, we can get back to that later.
I have just one. Yeah, so I have this, but I think we can discuss it. So maybe just for people to be clear is that in order to make this work, and there is more hands. In order to make this work, we would have to create the functions. We probably so this would be the pipeline as we have it right now. So this is the pipeline that would be running. So interface, DNN, NAD, and deploy. So the order matters a little bit, right? So you have to somehow, the ordering matters. With the new approach, we would have to add interface and DNN again into so we have to have them twice into the pipeline. Because the first one will create a resource. And John, it's correct that I'm saying is that if there is a new IP and VLAN allocated by the controller and they update it, that is similar to like updating the package, right?
Yes, they'll save the package, and so it will execute the pipeline again. So that would that be sufficient, or?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. See, the thing is the following. If you look to the whole flow, right, is that the one thing that you are depending upon is the IP and VLAN allocations, right? So that comes from the outside world. All the rest is known within the specialization, right? If you look, I didn't put the whole figure here, but if you maybe go to this slide, you see that actually all of these things are in the package except for VLAN and IP. Which means that, so, and just to be clear for people to understand, so this pipeline, so this is a pipeline that we put into a kept file. So in the package of that blueprint, when we started, we will write these functions as a pipeline in this order. And so what happens every time we save that package, this pipeline is executed. Okay. So in other words, so what is important now is that, okay, let's assume IP VLAN were not there, okay? let's say that somehow we don't need them, then this pipeline is executed once when a package is cloned or when someone saves it, when there is a new package created, right? So like you do a new commit or something like that. So these are the things by which this pipeline is run, okay? And so that means that there is, so if I would put, so the order of these two doesn't matter. The order of this guy matters towards interface because he will generate a resource that he will act upon. So in other words, the order in which we put that in the pipeline matters a bit. And that's why this is important. Now with the new approach, because we have this feedback mechanism to interface, that means that interface would have to run again because let's say NAD is now, he is dependent on it. He would need to put that back into the pipeline because he's depending on the result of NAD. So that's the reason why, this matters.
It might work because we have like other actors coming in and saving the package. It might just work, but it's sort of like a dangling, you're relying upon something that you're not sure of unless you ensure it by putting it at the very end as well. That's my thinking anyway.
Yeah, that's also one of the reasons when I dug into what I dug into last night. I mean, I briefly went for a walk thinking about this problem. That's why I realized about me in the tutorial. So my motivation is to have a very clean approach and very deterministic approach, and also a very clean guidance to the package authors. So here we are looking at a very specific example where we are running interface twice, DNN twice in this particular flow. But in general, if we have to abstract the problem, what we are saying is there is a dependency between your functions, and there is also dependency in your pipelines. So when I say dependency, it's more like a parent-child kind of a dependency.
Yeah.
So if kept is providing us that method, having a separate directory, I understand from John that he has some concerns that were posted, which we will need to determine. If it all that works, to me, that's a very intuitive way and a very natural way of solving things. So we can give the guidance to the package authors. When you write packages, and if you have this kind of a dependency where your parent needs to act based on certain actions of the child, and parents need to have all the results of the children in order to make progress, this is the way to go. I mean, this is.
I don't, it's not clear about all of those. I'm not sure subpackages.
No, I don't think space will work. Yeah.
Subdirectories, because what happens is they're scoped to, maybe this isn't true, this used to be true, but the functions, okay, so if it's a parent-child relationship, the parent is generating the child, and then there's another function that acts on that child. If the parent generates, maybe I'm misunderstanding your proposal, so clarify for me. If the parent is in the top level pipeline, and it generates a resource in a subdirectory, the pipeline for that subdirectory will have already run because it's depth first.
No, that's not what I meant. Sorry, okay. I think I might have misspoke. What I'm suggesting is, with the package author in this, let's take this particular example, right? Let's take this particular example. I can, since I do not understand the whole domain properly, I think example will help. In this particular case, we have interface, and then say we have VLAN, and we have NAT, right? So essentially we want interface to run. Interface will generate a condition for NAT, and it will generate a CRM for VLAN /IP. So we want those three to run, and then we want to run the interface again. That's the problem statement we have.
Yes.
Are we on the same page? Just want to understand.
Yes.
So what I'm
Because we
saying
want
is,
interface to update its condition and status based upon the results of the child resource allocation.
exactly. So what I'm suggesting is, let's have in a parent, we have a directory call. We have a top level directory where we have a KPD file, and then we have a subdirectory called components. And within that subdirectory called components, we have exactly the same structure as we have today. We have an interface. We have exactly this particular file where the interface
Right, this pipeline.
sorry, in the KPD file, the functions are defined the way it is today. And then when they aggregate, when those, obviously because it's depth first, those functions will be run in the order they are defined in that subdirectory's KPD file. And the parent KPD, once the execution is complete, the results are available to the KPD file that is in the parent directory, and they can aggregate it.
But I
That's
think,
what I mean.
but Bala, I think the challenge or the issue that we have right now is that this pipeline is a sequence, right? And so it runs once, and whether you put it in different directories or something like that doesn't really matter.
No. The thing, think about this. The way you design your pipeline in such that in your components, right? You have in your components, your interface is run, your NAD is run. Let's take out the example of DNN just for a minute. Just remove it. Yeah, let's take it out, DNN, for a minute. Let's just say we have enough deploy and interfaces, right? So I'm even forgetting enough deploy for a minute for now. Let's just understand that interface thing. So within the subdirectory, you have your interface function, NAD function, and VLAN, right? Obviously, VLAN is a controller, that's fine. And then those things will be run first because they are depth first. And those results are all in their own, maybe in the status fields, in the CRs, etc. And then in your parent folder, you have an aggregator function that's running, which is looking at all these results. Because now that all the children has run, then only the parent will run. So for the parent, you have the results of all the children.
But you have to do a change in the way that kept runs this thing, right? So that's what I was proposing yesterday. Today the pipeline is a sequence, right? If you make, for example, I have a DAG, you can actually implement this as a directed aggregate graph. So you can actually, or a cyclic graph, so you can actually create all this dependency. I have an implementation of that does that would solve this problem.
Hey guys, we have some more hands up. Other people want to join this conversation. Have some ideas. Vish, maybe you were first.
No, Tal, you were first.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, if you say so. So, I think this is. I kind of echo Bala here that I think this is overly complex. These relationships that we have to have between the functions are getting hard to maintain, especially because there can be complex interrelationships sometimes. I have a solution actually that I've been working on, which is different. I haven't proposed it yet because it's I don't want to derail the current place. But the issue is that we don't have an external controller, right? What I do, I have a controller that continuously pulls and runs the pipeline. So it has no idea of interdependencies. It only knows if functions have succeeded or not. So if a function could succeed in its specialization, it has everything it needs, it returns true. If not, it returns false. So specialization will only totally succeed if the entire pipeline runs successfully. So if something doesn't have its dependencies, it'll return false. But because I have an external controller, it will rerun the pipeline. So it goes through.
Total, I mean, if you look to the function controller that I proposed, right, it does all of that.
Right.
So it's not.
Yeah, we've also talked.
We cannot solve it, but we are talking R1, right? We are talking R1. What do we do?
Well, I don't want to introduce something very complex for R1 that might be solved in a different way later.
I mean, this is that. I think, yeah. I mean, this is about what this is still just a pipeline. Like the other option we talked about, which is very similar to what you're saying, Tal, is like we can actually have, like theoretically, right? These are idempotent functions and an idempotent function pipeline. So you should be able to execute it repeatedly until the set of resources stabilizes.
And right, by the way, they might not always stabilize. I mean, there could be a problem in your design.
Yes.
That means that not everything will work. So the pipeline will continually have at least one that fails. And that's okay, right? That there should be an error log somewhere to saying that you had a wrong
That will
design.
be there. That will be done, right? So the only thing that we are discussing for R1 is, what is ugly, I think, or not nice, is that we have to, in the pipeline, create the function 2 times. That's the bad thing.
So
Well,
I
why
still-
can't we do it right though? If we already have an idea to solve it better, shouldn't we devote more time to this? And
I mean, see, the question is, I mean, I have an implementation of a function controller that does it, right? So that's not the problem, but I think we want to focus on, I don't want to
say that that's not a problem, but it's, you know, it does add a technical depth and more, you know, so you're saying, yeah, maybe in the future we can remove it, but it's a complex piece of code, you know, and
Well, there's two things we're talking about here. I think that there's how we structure the resources and functions that are being run and operated on within a package. And I don't think that's in question here. Like any way we do this, there's a bit of a complicated dance because of the flexibility we want to put into our way of specifying requirements, and because of the complexity of generating NADs, you know, it requires inputs from multiple sources, and so that's the main problem in my mind we're trying to solve. And whether we, you know, whether we have to add the interface function twice in the pipeline, or we run the pipeline twice somehow from some external controller, or we do it through some package. I don't think the solution to that other problem changes, right? We're still going to have these resources. We're still going to have these functions. We're not talking about changing that. So to me, that's a little bit of a, like, I don't want to throw out our whole approach because of one small problem.
no, I don't think it's throwing out the approach, right? So again, I think that the solution I have works for me. You know, you repeat the pipeline, everybody gets a chance. The order does not matter, right? So maybe at first one of them will be green.
see, what you have to change is the way you basically decouple the whole kept side of things and the whole way you do that part of the house. That you have to change. Because I mean, I have an implementation that does exactly what we want to do, but the thing is that you decouple yourself from you use ports as a backend, not as a runtime. So it's a completely different approach. And that you can make this work, and it works with external functions and stuff like that. So like the IPAM, because you want to reach out to the outside. But I mean, I don't believe that for R1 this is feasible to put all in it, because it changes the whole approach. So I think
I really don't think it does, right? And it could be maybe in addition to porch that we would allow to, which we are doing anyway, right? But there's, you know, if you want these to be idempotent, and, you know, and functions should operate, you know, they check if they have everything they need. They sometimes succeed, they can sometimes fail. We want this to be components that are, you know, can work on their own, but we're creating this intricate link between component types right now. I think this adds a lot of complexity to the design.
No, I mean, the only thing right now, what is new is that you basically, I have to get the feedback, right? So that's the only thing. And as a result, the solution in R1 is to basically add these functions 2 times in the pipeline to get that feedback.
So
sorry, can I go ahead, Bala? 1 second.
Yeah, go ahead, Dish. I will go after.
Yeah. The impression in reading the kept tutorial is any function is idempotent. And what it seems to me is that when you look at this function, interface function, the first time it gives a different result versus the second time giving us a different result. That's the
No.
impression I'm getting, but it might not be
No,
the
that's
case.
not true. I see that the reason why you run them twice is it gets different information or new information.
So that
Right.
means the
Package
function, the
change,
first time
right?
you call the
Yes.
function is called as interface function init, and the second time you call it as interface function finalize. So
Yeah, correct.
if
So yeah, and it's the same implementation.
that might be what it is, even though
Yeah,
you're
that's
underneath.
basically what it is. That's why I call it in the beginning upstream and downstream, but in essence it's the same. The runtime will be the same. So you could basically call these things 2 times a different thing, but they are actually the same code.
Yeah, I mean, if this were to be done the way we are saying, it has to be done twice. It is not intuitive like what Bala was saying, but it is as simple as calling this the init and finalize. Maybe that is. I don't suggest that we have to rush into.
But I think what I was pointing to Bala is whatever Bala, what you're proposing. I understand what you're trying to propose, Bala, but you somehow change the way that the pipeline gets executed. So you have to do a change.
Do you mean
inside.
power?
No, there is no change. I'm not sure how it changes. That's the thing.
Yeah,
That's
the
why.
render.
That's
Bala,
why
you're talking about render, right? So kept function render actually does what Bala is saying. It always goes to the sub package.
I think Bala, just to be clear what you are saying, right? So you were saying you have a subdirectory where you have the child resources of a pipeline.
Yeah.
You have to run that, get the result.
No,
and then
not the child resources. If I actually I pasted this, if you see the chat, all I'm saying is just take the same approach as you're doing, but all I'm saying is change the way packages are designed. That's all I'm saying.
Structured. Yeah.
but
Yes,
you have to.
I'm not,
So Bala, you have to run it twice, right?
no,
No,
don't
no,
have to.
because the way I think he's right. The way the sub packages or the sub directories work is that if you, I mean, it's sort of equivalent to listing it in a flat one twice, but what you're doing is you're using nesting to.
Yes, but I use this with Porch, John. I mean, I'll try it again. In my view, they create 2 separate package revisions. So there's 2 separate packages. Even sub packages are seen by Porch as 2
files in there might get.
and they will run independent. So there's no relationship between them.
But
No,
according to the documentation,
if Porch is start honoring this, then there's a serious bug. I don't think it can completely treat it as a separate package because it's a subdirectory. The way the whole kept documentation works, it is a way of composition.
It is like that if you run it outside. If you run it within Porch, it behaves differently at the moment.
that was my next question. The kept function render, is there an equivalent for that? Because I know kept alpha is actually Porch. The FN render, is there an equivalent of that implemented in Porch?
Well, whenever you save it in Porch, it's under the hood doing it should be doing the equivalent of that, but it may not be handling these sub package kept files, subdirectory kept files properly.
Guys, I think we're
one more.
missing the
Sorry,
main
Tal,
narrative.
if you don't mind, I want to make one more distinction here. There is one difference I'm proposing, Wim here, keeping the spirit of functions, same input, same output all the time philosophy. What I'm suggesting is here in the chat window, if you see in the subcomponent within the component kept file is the same thing, but in the parent one, in the top level directory, I'm instead of reusing interface, I'm just calling it an interface aggregation or something, so that will take all the outputs from that is generated from the individual components, aggregate it, and then run the NF function. And then NF function, everything will be available because.
Now, Bala, one more question is, how do you run the function 2 times? I mean, how do you run it at the beginning of the components and at the end?
You're not running anything twice at all.
I think Bala means that the component will be specialized first.
Yes.
And only after the child components are specialized does the
Exactly.
outer level.
Yeah, it ends up running, like assuming interface aggregator and interface are essentially the same code. It ends up running it twice.
Yeah.
It runs the sub pipeline and then it runs the main pipeline, which is the finalizer.
So I think Bala's interjection here is better, but it's still not good enough for me because remember, we're trying to make something very declarative, and we're really introducing an imperative design here that you have to care about the order. You have to design a workflow. I
Yeah.
I think we're losing kind of the narrative. The idea is that you should throw everything declaratively, not think of the order, and have the framework, figure out what goes where and when, right? And here we're
Yeah.
requiring the designers to have an idea of a workflow of tasks.
No, I agree.
I'd rather
Charlie.
not go this way, and I don't think we have to. I think there are designs that don't need this, and
it was called as two different names. I think Vim, I mean, looking at it from immediately, using Bala's approach that he discovered, seems like it will fit in, function init and function finalize.
Yeah,
yes,
correct.
but-
So it's the
but it
same as
also
it's
requires
similar,
the
it's
designer-
similar
Here's
to.
Paul's
I mean,
point, like,
it's similar to calling an init function and an exit function, but calling the same
It's
code.
just philosophically, I was thinking there are two separate functions. To me, a function is to be so deterministic, it has to provide all the out. I mean, my understanding may be wrong. Idempotency means when you run it, always it outputs the same. It generates the
no,
same.
it means that
Right, but
with
the
the same
input changes.
inputs, it's
Every
the same
function
output.
can change the entire package, so its inputs change. So now it's
Yeah.
going to run differently.
Yeah.
See, it's built
I-
idempotent,
actually,
Bala.
That's why I call it
Okay,
interface
guys,
aggregator.
we're over time. I want to stop for a second. Anybody who, I can keep going, but we should be, others may want to drop off. Is there anybody who needs to make a comment before they go?
Yeah, I just tried to comment, listening to all the comments. I would rather go with the flat pipeline, but just call the functions with different names rather than complicating it in layers. And it keeps the essence of the thing. When people see that, it simplifies the world. If you were to create relationships within the kept packages, I think it complicates things.
But that is supported though today.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
It is part of the.
I actually, okay, thank you, Ravi. I think that okay, do we want to continue this discussion? I'm happy to stay.
I got another
Yes,
meeting, but I don't want to miss this.
Yeah, I have
I would
another
like
meeting
to-
too.
So I have another 30 minutes.
No, actually, we
you.
want to postpone this because we don't want to miss it. Some of us have meetings to go to. We don't want to miss this.
Okay, I mean, I think we do want to move forward. I think we can, here's my opinion. We should move forward with what Wim has, and then we can talk about whether the solution, because I think it actually doesn't impact his progress right now. If we can then talk about the solution of, we can list it twice, we can put it in a sub package, or we can have have it execute the pipeline repeatedly until it stabilizes or not. I actually am leaning towards what Tal says, and I see his point that in order for it to be declarative, right, it should converge. And so it's that eventual consistency, that convergence that we eventually want. But let's.
Yeah, what is missing from the whole pipeline right now is the feedback loop, right? So there is no, that's the same thing as I said before, John, we don't have a watch, right? So there is, so that's why also I created a controller actually outside, and it actually runs functions in Harmony, and it does that. But it has an engine that executes it and gets that Harmony, but it has an event loop to get feedback, and then you get a completely declarative approach. But at the moment with what we have, I think we can build with what we have. The function implementation, as I had, you could actually put back into that thing, because I do the similar things that I put in the function runtime. It's there because it's filtering and so on and so forth. So it does similar things at the end of the day.
Okay, well, why don't we continue this in your meeting tomorrow, Wim, and then, but I think that you can probably proceed with what you have. This decision doesn't directly affect, I think, the plan you have right now.
No, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank
Wim.
you.
Thanks, John. Have a good one.